Thank you, Aaron. Well, welcome, you guys. If you haven't been here the last few weeks, we've been looking at this letter that Paul writes to the church in Corinth. And we've been saying, let's get real, as it says on the screen, looking at real issues. And, oh boy, we got a big one today to look at. And I know some of you are a little bit antsy when that passage was being read, like, where's this guy going to go today with this? Here's the thing. We believe that the church is messy. The church overall, any church, our church, it's because it's full of messy people. And Paul is writing to this young Corinthian church in a diverse, cosmopolitan city, a city that would have been filled with transient people coming in and out, going east and west across different bodies of water. And the church, of course, would have been made up of these diverse people, and they're new Christians, too. They're recent converts, and they're kind of trying to figure out what it means to live as a Christian. And Paul, he tackles some really, really controversial issues in the church, because this church in Corinth is messy, and Paul wants to address it. Now, here's the interesting thing. I was sitting last Sunday, if you were here, you know that I talked about conflict, church conflict. Good old-fashioned church conflict, when people in church rubbed you the wrong way, when you had a problem with somebody in church. And what's interesting was we were sitting, my wife and I, at dinner on Sunday night, and she said, that's probably one of the first times I've heard a sermon about church conflict when there is no church conflict, which is a good thing. We don't have, as far as I know, you could tell me if you have conflict with somebody else right now in the church. I don't think, I get smiles, so I don't think anybody really does. I probably would know about it if you did. And that's the good thing. And I said, well, that's interesting, because she said, you know, normally when you hear sermons on conflict in the church, it's usually when there is a conflict going on, and the pastor's trying to address it from the pulpit, which is a dangerous thing to do. It's like when, you know, the church isn't getting enough money and the pastor stands up and gives you a nice sermon on tithing, you know, giving. God wants you to give. See, what we're doing here, and today we're talking about church discipline. I don't think anybody needs to be disciplined here in church today. I hope not. Nobody needs it to the extent of what Paul's talking about here. But this is good, because this is what we can do. We can be preventative rather than medicative. Does that make sense? We can look at these issues in advance and know what Paul says and how to deal with it when it comes up, rather than wait until it comes up, like the church in Corinth did, and then have to go into damage control, triage mode, bandage mode, medication mode. And this issue Paul talks about today, it's a big one. It's scandalous. This is, I call this soap opera material. You know, you got this guy he talks about who's sleeping with his father's wife. And from the text, from the Greek, we probably assume that it was his stepmother, not his biological mother. Nonetheless, Paul takes a great issue with this. And he wants to talk about not necessarily that action, but rather how you would discipline and what church discipline is and what it is not and why you do it. And it's actually really profound if you look at this. Church discipline. How do you discipline in the church, and what is it supposed to be? See, this church was bragging about this, Paul says. He says, why are you boasting about this? And what it would be in modern day terms is people saying, you know, we're saved by grace, so therefore it's okay. It's okay. I know, but it's okay. And Paul says, no, it's not okay. But it's not okay for the reasons you think. He gives an entirely new paradigm to what church discipline is. And I know you're sitting here and you looked at the bulletin and you said, oh, church discipline. What is he going to do? And no, I'm not calling out names today, and I'm not bringing the hammer down, because that's not what Paul does, actually. Paul, interestingly enough, does not address the man by name. Did you notice this? Nor does he address the female by name. See, if you read Paul's letters, he loves calling people out. If he likes you, he'll say your name. If he doesn't like you, he'll say your name as well. He loves names. He drops names all throughout his letters. He's constantly saying, hey, you, this person and that person, and he's putting it in bold print. Names that are famous now for either reasons that Paul liked them or he didn't like them. They were doing something good or they were doing something bad. But interestingly enough, he doesn't say the name of this person. Because Paul wants us to see that discipline in the church has much more to do with the community than it does necessarily with the individual. Throughout this passage, what we'll see today is he stresses what discipline does to the community. And I want to put it under three headings this way. First, Paul gives us the need for church discipline. Secondly, he gives us the goal of it, which is going to surprise you a little bit. And then lastly, he gives us the means for it. So he gives us the need for church discipline, why we would need it, why they need it, and why we need it today. And then he gives us the goal of it, which is different than what you and I might otherwise think. And lastly, he gives us the way to do it in the most radically beautiful way possible. Let me jump into this, and you can follow along. You can take notes on your bulletin if you want. I didn't print out outlines this week, but here's what he does. But like I said, first, the need. I said Paul does not directly say the name of this person, because he doesn't have so much of a problem with the person, although he says some harsh things about this guy. But he turns his gaze to the community, and he says, listen, people, the problem is with you guys. Yeah, he's got a problem, but really fundamentally, the discipline that you need is for you, the community, he says. He's actually really more concerned with what this person's actions have done to the community as a whole. Let me give the illustration, and I'll explain what I mean by this. It's actually, Paul gives the illustration. Let me unpack it a little bit for you if you don't know much about cooking or food preparation. And I love this part. Whenever Paul uses food metaphors, I love it because I get to stand up here and talk about cooking, and I love doing that. So here's what he says. He says, he mentions this whole thing about leavening, and old leaven, and what new leaven. What's he talking about? What he's talking about is the fact that sin is not privatized. Sin affects everything around you in the community. Let me explain. So back in this day, some of your translations may say, don't you know a little bit of yeast spoils the whole dough? The version Aric read says, don't you know that a little leaven spoils the whole lump? The yeast, if you know about yeast, yeast has good bacteria, okay? You put yeast into bread, why? To make it rise. But back in the day here, yeast was very expensive. So they didn't actually use yeast in this area. What they did was, they took bread and a dough. Before you make bread, I know you're getting a cooking lesson today, but it is theological. They took off a part of it, and they let it ferment. And this part of this fermentation, what they would do is, every time they would make a new batch of bread, they would take a little bit of the old leaven, which is what it was called, that was fermented, and they'd pull off a piece. And they'd add it to the dough, that way the bread would rise. Otherwise, you'd have unleavened bread, which is flat bread. Risen bread is more delicious. Now, what's the point? What's he saying here? They used this old leaven, this piece of dough that was fermented, stinky, gross a little bit, because the fermentation allowed the other bread to rise. But he says, you got to get rid of the old leaven. And every year before Passover, what you had to do as a Jewish tradition was empty your house of everything that was leavened. It was a way of saying, you got to get rid of the old leaven in your house, because if it stays around too long, it'll ferment and make everything putrid. You had to throw it away. Every year they went through this cleansing ritual. See, what Paul is saying is this. The old leaven, if you let it sit, it will corrupt the rest of the whole batch of dough. What he's saying is, if you let this sin go on, it doesn't just affect him, it affects all of you. Sin is not privatized, it's not individualistic. If you're going through something, and if you're struggling with something, it's going to necessarily affect me and the person sitting next to you. Sin, that's how it works. It permeates everything, and he says, this is what you need to do. You need to remove it. Why? For his good, yes. For the person who did wrong, yes, but also for the community's good. The old leaven would have been putrid and nasty after 1 year. You take a little bit off, and you let it sit in this liquid that was fermenting it more. And you let it sit, and you let it do that with food, and you'll see. Give it a year. Come back in a year and see what the food looks like. It's gross. It's disgusting. And so he says, every year you've got to get rid of this. He says, this is what church discipline fundamentally is. The need for it is the need to keep the community holy, the need to keep the community rising. That's what it means to remove the old leaven in your life personally and communally. It means disciplining yourself to say, I'm going to find the stinky, putrid stuff in my heart. I'm going to find the stinky, putrid stuff in our community, and I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to get rid of it. Why? Because it will damage the whole of the batch if you let it sit. That's the need for it. Paul says, don't be mistaken. You think that if that person has a problem, that it's just their problem? Not a chance. It's your problem too, and it will impact you. Do you think that if you have a friend who has a drinking problem, that it doesn't affect you? Yes, it does, and you know, because you can't rely on them. You can't count on them sometimes. Sometimes they feel like they're not even there. Do you have a friend who has a problem with greed? And you know, is that their problem alone? No, you know that it impacts you because they're not generous to you. They're not giving to you. You know that the problems that people have in their life, in their heart, the gunky old leaven, the putrid old leaven, takes over the whole batch. And Paul says, this is why you need church discipline, for the sake of the community as a whole. But Paul, secondly, says this. Here's the goal of it. Now, I know when you read this passage, and like me, you look at this part, and he says, give him over to Satan. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is Paul bringing the hammer down. Okay. And I know that you probably have been in churches where you've looked at people doing wrong things, and you say, ha ha ha, Paul says, I got to turn you over to Satan. Paul says, I'm going to cast you out. And you look at the person and you say, aha, you know who you are. You know what you did. I know you've been in churches like that. People pointing fingers. And Paul says, no. If you look back at the passage here, it says, but for the sake of the community, it says that the Spirit might be saved on the day of the Lord. He says, give him over. If this person's doing something wrong habitually over and over again, give them over. But why? What's the goal? So that his spirit could be saved, he says. Do you see what Paul's doing? He's saying church discipline fundamentally is not about you getting your just desserts over somebody else. It's not about you saying, aha, I got you. Now I can expose you. He says church discipline is for the good of that other person. You should be pouring over their spirit. Church discipline, if you're going to be disciplining somebody in church, and you do it all the time, informally or formally, you need to look at that person and say, this is for your spirit. The goal of any church discipline is not punitive damages. It's not seeking out your rights for somebody else's wrongs. This is why Paul says later to the Corinthian church, he says, don't drag each other into court. And this is why he's stressing this on the people inside the church. He's saying, look, people, if you're going to discipline somebody, know this. It's not about punishing them. It's about uplifting them. There's a quote, and it's my favorite quote from C.S. Lewis, and I put it in your bulletin. And believe it or not, I quote C.S. Lewis all the time. You guys know this. Believe it or not, in 4 years of preaching here, I've never used this quote, and I don't know why, because it is my favorite, and I almost memorized it. But he says this. This is what he means by what discipline can do. This is how C.S. Lewis would write something like this. It's in The Weight of Glory, and he says, it is a serious thing to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would strongly be tempted to worship. Or else a horror and a corruption, such as now you meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. Listen to this. All day long, in some degree, we are helping each other to one or another of these destinations. You see what he's saying here? He's saying, look at the people around you. And one day they will either be the most glorious creature that you almost want to worship if you saw them now in heaven, or one day they will be the most disgusting creature that you would have in a nightmare. But he says, you're doing it. You're pushing them to one or the way or the other. See, this is the goal of church discipline. And let me say this as an aside note. I know that you think church discipline and you think it's the pastor who gets on to people. No, this is everything you guys do. You do it during coffee time. Informally, you do it all the time, over lunch. It's whenever you get involved in somebody else's life to the extent that you could say, hey, I see something going on here with you, and I think you need to fix it. I think we need to work on this. See how that radically changes coffee hour. So now you're going to be talking to each other over coffee thinking, am I pushing you closer to heaven or closer to hell? Now you're going to be scared. You're not going to say anything during coffee hour, are you? But what C.S. Lewis says is exactly what Paul's saying about this idea of church discipline. He says, listen, put the person out, but why are you doing it? You're not doing it for punitive damages. You're not doing it to punish. You're not doing it to control. You're not doing it just to get your edge over him or her or your rights justified. You're doing it for their spirit. You're doing it to make the person be the future glory self that they always meant to be. And this is why church discipline has to be a perfect balance of truth and love. See, when you get to know people in this church at coffee hour or lunch, whenever, and you start looking into their life and you start seeing things that are not so right, that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, you have a choice. You can either give them only truth, which will just beat them down. It'll guilt them. You'll say, aha, here's the truth. Or you can only give them love and say, it's not a big deal, don't worry. Neither one of those helps the other person. Neither one of those pushes the person into the right direction, as C.S. Lewis would say. You need a balance of truth and love. You need to be able to say, here's the truth about your life, but here's why I'm saying it, because I love you this much. I truly love you. See, the goal of discipline in the church, what Paul is trying to accomplish here, he's trying to take the old leaven out of the church so that it won't corrupt the whole. Now, how do you get to this place? How do you get to the place of discipline where you can balance perfectly truth and love with people? How do you get to that point? Because I guarantee you, if you're like me, I don't know, you probably err on one side or the other. I would err, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll err on one side or the other for sure. One side, you're going to give them truth. There's a lot of people who love to tell truth. Hey, I see what's going on in your life. And there's a lot of people who love to just give love. It's okay, give a hug. And there's no big deal. And no, Paul says you need both. The old leaven has to be removed. Why? Out of compassion and mercy and care for their spirit so that they're saved. So how do you get to that place then? How do you get to the place where you can perfectly balance truth and love? Paul gives the answer here. And it's one of the most paradoxically weird things that you're ever going to try to wrap your head around. And I don't have the time to fully unpack it this morning, but I'm going to try a little bit. If you look back here at verse 7, Paul gives us this wonderfully interesting phrase. And he says, be a new unleavened batch as you really are, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Now, wait a second. Just let that tinker around your, pinball around your head for a second. He says, listen, essentially what he's saying, translation, be holy. You're already holy. What the what? He says, be holy. You're already holy. He says, be unleavened. Get the old leaven, that putrid stuff, get it out. Be unleavened. You're already unleavened. And I get some quizzical looks. That's good. That should make you go, what is he saying? This is what Paul's saying. He's not saying, be holy and therefore God will love you. He's saying, don't you know God already loves you? Christ was the Passover lamb. And if you remember the story in Exodus, the Jewish slaves were trying to be free. Plague after plague, and Pharaoh refuses to let them go. And God says, I will send the angel of death and kill the firstborn of everybody in this town, all of Egypt. But he says, if you want to escape from it, you have to take a lamb, sacrifice it, and put the lamb blood on your doorpost. And when the angel of death comes and he sees the blood of the lamb, he'll pass over your house. You'll be spared. Not because of anything you've done or accomplished or achieved or haven't done, not by any mistakes you've made or any righteous things you've ever done, he says. It's the blood that does it, not you. This is an incredibly radical paradigm shift. You want to remove the old leaven in your life? Know that he already went to the cross and removed it. Doesn't that sound completely, insanely paradoxical? Paul says, be holy. You're already holy. Why? Because of what he did for you. He takes the old leaven out. He took it out of your life. And therefore, if you know that, to the extent that you know that it was Christ going to the cross to take all the putrid, stinky stuff in your life and deal with it, to take the old leaven and toss it aside and say, no more. You will not be reigned by this disgusting, fermented stuff anymore in your heart. If you know that, it'll radically change the way you look at other people when they're dealing with the old leaven in their lives. You'll start to say, look what he did for me. Utter grace, utter mercy. He takes the old leaven, all that stinky stuff in my heart. He took it. He bore it. Now, I can bear it for others. Secular thought would say, you're loved, so go do whatever you want. Be free. That's what the Corinthian church was saying. We're loved by God, so let's be free. On the other hand, religion, contemporary but basic religion, law, the church would say, no, be holy and then you'll be loved. Earn it. The gospel says, you're loved already. The old leaven has been taken out. And when you know that love, then you will be holy. It's grace that motivates you to holiness, and it's grace that motivates you to discipline. It's love. The only thing in all my discussions with anybody, in talking with them about things that have made a difference in their life, the one thing that always comes up, the constant theme, you know what it is? Love. You could do anything for the other person. You can talk to them all you want. You can lay down your life for them, pretty much. Give them anything that they ask for. But if you give them love, love will change them. Love will discipline them. To the extent that you know you were loved, and the old leaven in your life was removed, then you can approach people. Let me close with a story here. Let me close with a story. I wrote a book about his father, a guy named Tony Dokapol. Don't worry about his last name. I can't even pronounce it. That's why I had to look at his name again. Let's just call him Tony. He's a journalist from America. He wrote a book last year called The Last Pirate, and it's about his father. And all of his life, his father was a drug dealer. He was one of the more wealthiest drug dealers in the eastern coast of America. But all of his life growing up, Tony never knew that. His parents lied to him. And he's going to private schools, and he's having a charmed life. And all the while, he was told his dad sold real estate in Vermont, of all places. And so he had this lie all of his life. And at about the age of 10, his father disappeared. And he didn't hear from him for another 20 years, all the while thinking that his father was just a businessman. 20 years later, his father shows up, and he's haggard. He's mentally off. He's scarred from being in jail. He's broken. He's literally broke. He's poor. He's dealing with issues of being bipolar. See, all the 20 years that he had been away from Tony, he had gotten hooked on drugs after dealing them for so long. He became a drug addict. He went to jail. He suffered. He did a lot of other bad things that Tony recounts. Tony was a journalist and had to do all this research on his father because he was curious. And then he finds out all this information about his father that he never knew. And his father's still alive, and Tony was giving an interview recently, last year, and they were talking about this book, and they were saying the interaction between him and his father. And the reporter asked Tony, she says, did you ever miss your father? Like, what did you miss him at all? And Tony gave an interesting thing. He says, of course, all my life I loved my mother, but she and I were very different, he said. And then he says, when my father came back, I realized I was just like him. He says, that's where I was missing. He says, my mother and I, we were not ever the same person. I had a different personality. And then 20 years later, my father resurfaces, and I realize I'm like him. And so the reporter asked him, didn't it worry you to think that you'd end up the same way as him? Addicted, broke, alone, lonely, destitute, a felon. And Tony gives an interesting answer. He says, yes, it did scare me. It scared me that I would end up like him. I looked at this man and I thought, this is where I come from. His synapses were my synapses. His DNA was my DNA. If he ended up like this, what's to say that I wouldn't end up like that? The old leaven. The reporter comes back to him and says, well, why didn't you end up like that? And Tony says, I don't really know. I don't know if it was my mother's love or my father finally putting his arm around me and letting me enter into his story later in life. But I always felt a sense of deep, deep love. And that gave me the autonomy to know I could go a different trajectory. I didn't need to end up like him. He says love. He says he felt some love. He says he felt a sense of love. And it was that love that allowed him to get rid of the old leaven. Brothers and sisters today, if you want to get rid of the old leaven in your life, the only thing that will do it is love. Do not fear that you have to repeat the same things of your parents, the same things they did, the same things you've been doing for years. It's this moment today that Paul says, get the old leaven out. The only way you're going to do it is if you look at the cross, see him splattered for you, see him cut for you, see him dying for you. And Paul says, if you see that he was sacrificed for you, the old leaven is gone. Feel that sense of love this morning. Go in prayer. It's silent prayer. So I invite Scott and Yoshik to come back up to close us with our final song. Go to God in prayer right now.